For 40 years the boy had never opened his eyes. Then a poor baker arrived carrying a basket of bread, and the impossible finally moved. Rain hammered the narrow mountain road in silver sheets as Elena Brooks leaned her shoulder against the wind and tightened her grip around the wicker basket hanging from her arm. The smell of fresh bread rose through the damp air, warm and comforting against the cold morning. She had been awake since 3:30, kneading dough before sunrise in a bakery that barely paid enough to keep the lights on. Every loaf in the basket mattered. Every dollar mattered. The storm had arrived without warning, turning the gravel road into mud and washing the color from the world. Ahead of her, beyond the curtain of rain, Blackthorn Castle stood on the ridge like a forgotten monument. Its stone towers disappeared into low clouds. Most people in town avoided looking at it for too long. Stories had a way of growing around places like that. Stories about vampires. Stories about a king who had ruled for centuries. Stories about a prince who had been asleep for 40 years. Elena never paid much attention to rumors. Rumors didn't help pay rent. Rumors didn't keep food on the table. She believed in flour, ovens, and hard work, nothing else. Thunder rolled across the valley as she climbed the final stretch toward the service entrance. The iron gate stood open. That alone felt strange. Usually 2 guards inspected every delivery before allowing anyone inside. Today the courtyard looked unusually quiet, empty. The rain echoed against stone walls and dark windows. Elena stepped through the gate and hurried toward the kitchen entrance. Before she reached it, a sharp voice called from behind. "You there, delivery?" She turned. A castle servant hurried across the courtyard, holding a lantern beneath his coat. "The storm-damaged part of the West Wing. Kitchen deliveries are being redirected. Come with me." Elena hesitated. "I usually leave everything in the kitchen. Not today." The servant already started walking. "Unless you'd like to carry that basket back down the mountain." Elena sighed and followed. The castle felt colder inside than it had outside. Long corridors stretched beneath vaulted ceilings. Candles flickered behind glass lanterns. Their reflections danced across polished stone floors. The deeper they went, the quieter everything became. Eventually the servant stopped outside a heavy wooden door. "Wait here." Without another word, he disappeared down the hall. Elena stood alone. Rain tapped softly against distant windows. Somewhere far away a clock chimed. Then she heard it, a heartbeat, slow, weak, barely there. At first she thought she imagined it, but the sound came again, faint, uneven. The door beside her stood slightly open, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. Curiosity pulled her forward before caution could stop her. She glanced down the empty corridor. No one was watching. Carefully, she pushed the door open another inch. The room beyond was enormous. Curtains of black velvet surrounded a large bed positioned beneath tall windows. Pale grey light filtered through the storm outside. A young man lay motionless beneath silver blankets. He looked no older than 25. His skin was impossibly pale. Dark hair framed a face that silence around him felt unnatural. Elena immediately understood who she was looking at. Prince Lucian Romano, the sleeping prince. The boy who had never opened his eyes. She should have stepped away. Instead, she found herself moving closer. The weak heartbeat echoed again, almost fading. Her grandmother had once worked as a nurse. Old habits survived in strange ways. Elena reached toward the prince's wrist, intending only to check whether the stories were true. The moment her fingers brushed his skin, the heartbeat changed. Thump, stronger. Elena froze. Another beat followed, then another, stronger each time. The prince's chest rose slightly deeper than before. A faint tremor moved through his hand. Elena jerked backward so quickly she nearly stumbled. The voice came from the doorway, deep, calm, terrifying. Elena turned. A tall man stood there dressed in black. Rainwater still glistened across his coat. His pale face revealed nothing, but his silver eyes were locked on the prince, then on her. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder, more dangerous. And what Elena didn't know was that every healer, physician, scholar, and miracle worker who had touched that prince during the last 40 years had failed. Yet somehow, within seconds of her arrival, the sleeping boy had moved, and the vampire king had seen everything. The first thing Elena noticed was that nobody rushed to help the prince. Instead, every pair of eyes in the room turned toward her. The silence felt heavier than the storm outside. The tall man in black stepped forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the stone floor. Up close, he looked even more imposing. His pale face remained unreadable, but the air around him seemed colder, somehow. Elena instinctively took a step back. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I should not have come in here. The door was open and I only wanted to make sure he was all right." The man's silver eyes shifted toward the prince. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he crossed the room and stopped beside the bed. Elena watched as he placed 2 fingers against the young man's wrist. His expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Concern, hope, fear. It vanished so quickly she could not be certain she had seen it. "Your Majesty." Several footsteps echoed from the hallway. 3 men hurried into the chamber carrying leather cases and medical instruments. They froze when they saw Elena standing near the bed. One of them, an older physician with white hair and round glasses, moved directly to the prince. He checked Lucien's pulse, then he checked it again. His hands began to tremble. "This is impossible," he whispered. His heartbeat has increased. Another physician leaned closer, by nearly 12%. The room erupted into hushed discussion. Elena stood awkwardly beside the curtains, clutching the handle of her bread basket so tightly her fingers hurt. She wished she could disappear. "What happened before the change?" the older physician asked. Nobody answered. Then every face turned toward Elena again. "I touched his wrist," she admitted. "That is all." The physicians exchanged skeptical glances. One of them actually laughed. 40 years of specialists from around the world, and the answer is a baker? The king silenced him with a single look. The physician immediately lowered his head. "What is your name?" the king asked. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of authority that left little room for argument. "Elena Brooks." "And how long have you been delivering bread here?" "Almost 3 years. Have you ever entered this room before?" "Never." The king studied her carefully. Elena felt as though he could see every secret she had ever kept. Unfortunately for her, Sebastian Romano was not searching for secrets. He was searching for explanations, and after 40 years without answers, even the smallest possibility mattered. A sudden sound interrupted the room. A faint scrape against fabric. Everyone turned toward the bed. Prince Lucien's fingers had moved again. This time there was no doubt. The motion was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. One physician dropped his notebook. Another crossed himself. The king stared at his son without blinking. For the first time, Elena saw emotion crack through his carefully controlled exterior. Not joy, not yet. Something more fragile than that. The possibility of joy. "Prepare the East guest suite," he said without taking his eyes off the prince. The room fell silent again. "Your Majesty?" one servant asked. "Miss Brooks will remain at the castle." Elena's heart nearly stopped. "Remain," she repeated. "I cannot stay. I have work tomorrow morning. Your bakery will be compensated." "That is not the point." The king finally turned toward her. For 40 years nothing has changed. Today his gaze remained steady. "Until I understand why you are not leaving." Before Elena could respond, a golden shimmer appeared beneath the prince's sleeve. The physicians gasped. The older doctor carefully rolled back the fabric. An unfamiliar symbol glowed faintly against Lucien's pale skin. Ancient lines, a circular pattern, something none of them had seen before. Elena stared at the mark, confused. Then her breath caught. Because hidden within the center of that glowing symbol was a shape she recognized immediately. It was identical to the design stamped onto the bottom of a small silver pendant her grandmother had left her years ago, and as the symbol brightened, every person in the room realized the impossible mystery had only just begun. By sunrise, the entire castle seemed to be holding its breath. Elena had barely slept. The guest suite they gave her was larger than the apartment above the bakery where she lived, yet the enormous room felt strangely empty. Rain still tapped softly against the windows as pale morning light crept across the floor. The image of the glowing symbol would not leave her mind. Neither would the matching design on the pendant hidden inside her coat pocket. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "His Majesty requests your presence." The servant waited quietly outside, while Elena followed him through a maze of corridors. This part of the castle felt different from the grand halls she had seen the day before. Less polished, older. Dust lingered in the corners. Portraits lined the walls. Hundreds of faces watched from gilded frames as she passed. Some looked noble, others looked tired. All of them were long dead. Eventually the servant stopped before a pair of enormous oak doors. Beyond them lay a chamber unlike anything Elena had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched into shadow. Thousands of books filled the room. Leather bindings. Ancient journals, stacks of documents tied with ribbon. A massive fireplace burned quietly near the far wall. Sebastian Romano stood beside a long table covered with open records. "You wanted to see me?" Elena asked. The king glanced up from a yellow document. "I wanted to show you something." Elena approached cautiously. Several large ledgers had been opened side by side. Names filled the pages, dates, medical reports, observations, notes written in different handwriting. "What are these?" she asked. "Every healer who attempted to help my son." Elena looked down. The first entry was dated nearly 40 years ago, then another and another. The pages continued for what seemed like forever. Hundreds of names, specialists, scholars, physicians, mystics. experts from around the world. There were this many, she whispered. More. Sebastian turned another page. Many stayed weeks, some stayed months. Elena slowly scanned the records. Every entry ended the same way. No change, no response, no improvement. The repetition felt haunting. 40 years reduced to failure written in neat lines of ink. Then why did he react to me? She asked quietly. The king's expression remained calm. That is exactly what I intend to discover. Before Elena could answer, a physician rushed into the library carrying several folders. Your Majesty. He stopped when he noticed Elena. The examination is complete. Sebastian gestured for him to continue. The physician opened one folder. The prince's pulse remains elevated. The symbol is still visible. There is something else. The physician placed a photograph on the table. Elena leaned closer. The image showed an old painting hanging somewhere inside the castle. A woman stood beneath a flowering tree. She wore simple clothes rather than noble attire. Her expression was gentle, familiar. Elena stared at the image. Why does she look like me? The room became silent. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The shape of the face, the eyes, even the slight curve of the smile. Sebastian studied the photograph carefully. The portrait was discovered in the West Gallery this morning. Who is she? Elena asked. We do not know. The physician shifted uneasily. That is not entirely true. Both Elena and the king looked toward him. There should have been a plaque beneath the portrait, the physician admitted. A name, a description. Should have? Sebastian repeated. The physician nodded. Someone removed it. The king's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, with concentration. Another puzzle piece had appeared, another question without an answer. Elena could not stop looking at the photograph. The woman seemed almost alive, as if she had been waiting 40 years to be remembered. Then the physician produced one final document. There is more. He placed a thin folder on the table. Unlike the others, it was nearly empty. A single page remained inside. Across the top, written in faded ink, was a reference number and a title. Missing Archive File 27. Subject, Evelyn. Elena had never heard the name before, but the moment she read it, something deep inside the mystery shifted. And somewhere else in the castle, hidden behind a locked door nobody had opened in decades, the rest of Evelyn's story was waiting to be found. The portrait was gone before sunset. Elena discovered it by accident. After spending most of the afternoon answering questions from physicians and scholars, she finally slipped away from the crowded chambers and followed the directions one of the servants had mentioned earlier. The West Gallery occupied an older section of the castle, rarely visited by guests. Tall windows overlooked the cliffs beyond the valley. Golden evening light spilled across marble floors and stretched long shadows between rows of paintings. Elena moved quietly through the corridor, searching for the woman whose face looked so much like her own. When she finally reached the spot shown in the photograph, she stopped. The wall was empty. A rectangular patch of lighter stone marked where the painting had once hung. Fresh dust floated through the sunlight. Someone had removed it recently, very recently. Elena stared at the vacant space. The feeling was difficult to explain. She had never met the woman. She did not even know her name. Yet seeing the empty wall felt strangely personal, as though a missing piece of a story had been taken away before she could read it. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to find Sebastian approaching from the opposite end of the gallery. The king glanced toward the empty wall and immediately understood why she was there. You noticed. Elena folded her arms. Someone did not want us finding out who she was. Sebastian studied the stone surface carefully. The question is why. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, clouds drifted across the fading sky. The storm had finally passed. Far below, the lights of distant towns began appearing one by one. Elena looked back at the empty space. Do you think she is connected to your son? Possibly. Do you think she is connected to me? For the first time, Sebastian did not answer immediately. I think there are too many coincidences. The honesty surprised her. So did the exhaustion in his voice. For 2 days she had seen him command physicians, direct investigations, and manage an entire castle without hesitation. Yet now, standing in the quiet gallery, he looked less like an immortal king and more like a father carrying 40 years of unanswered questions. Before either could speak again, a servant appeared at the end of the hall. Your Majesty. The young man bowed quickly. The prince's condition has changed. Sebastian was already moving before the sentence finished. Elena followed through twisting corridors and down 2 flights of stairs. The atmosphere inside the castle felt different now. Word had spread. Hope moved through the halls like electricity. When they entered Lucien's chamber, several physicians surrounded the bed. The prince remained asleep, but something had undeniably changed. Color had returned to his face. The grey stillness Elena remembered from her first visit was fading. More astonishing was the symbol on his wrist. The glowing pattern had expanded. New lines stretched outward like branches, forming a larger design. The physician stepped aside as Sebastian approached. The oldest doctor adjusted his glasses. His pulse continues to strengthen. He pointed toward a series of handwritten charts, and every increase seems to occur shortly after Miss Brooks enters the room. Elena blinked. What does that mean? We do not know. The physician sounded frustrated by the admission, but the correlation is undeniable. Another doctor carefully opened a leather folder. There is something else. He withdrew a fragile sheet of paper discovered during the archive search. Most of the writing had faded beyond recognition. Only a few lines remained legible. The room grew quiet as he read them aloud. If anything happens to me, the child must never know. The pendant will protect her until the time comes. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. Slowly, almost instinctively, her hand moved toward the silver pendant hidden beneath her sweater. Nobody else noticed. Not yet. Unfortunately for Elena, somewhere inside the castle another person had already discovered the truth about the missing portrait, and before the night was over that person intended to make sure nobody ever saw it again. Some names refused to stay buried. Elena realized that the following morning, when she found the castle archives in complete disarray, the investigation had moved overnight. Servants carried stacks of records through narrow hallways. Physicians compared handwritten notes at long tables. Even the atmosphere felt different. The cautious optimism that had spread through the castle after Lucien's improvement had now been joined by something else: urgency. Someone wanted answers before the trail disappeared again. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows as Elena entered the archive wing carrying a tray of coffee she had volunteered to deliver. The familiar smell of paper and dust filled the air. Several scholars barely looked up from their work. Others were studying maps. Family registries and census reports gathered from nearby towns. At the center of the room stood Sebastian Romano. He had not slept. Elena could tell immediately. His posture remained straight, but exhaustion lingered around his eyes. 40 years of disappointment had taught him not to trust hope too quickly, yet hope had arrived anyway. You should eat something, Elena said quietly as she set a cup beside him. Sebastian looked almost surprised by the suggestion. Then a faint smile appeared. Small, brief, real. That sounds suspiciously like an order. Someone has to make sure the king survives his own investigation. The smile lingered for a moment before fading. We found something. He handed her a folder recovered from a storage room hidden behind the oldest section of the library. Most of the contents had been damaged by time. Several pages were unreadable. Others had entire sections removed. But one name appeared repeatedly. Evelyn. Elena lowered herself into a chair and carefully examined the records. Every mention of Evelyn seemed connected to medical consultations, research, and castle visits dating back more than 40 years. Yet no complete explanation remained. It was as if someone had deliberately erased her from history while accidentally leaving fragments behind. Who was she? Elena asked. We still do not know. Sebastian turned another page. But she was important enough that someone spent decades hiding evidence of her existence. A scholar suddenly hurried across the room carrying a thin ledger. Your Majesty, the young man looked excited. We found a registry from the neighboring county. Everyone nearby stopped working. The scholar opened the book. There was a woman named Evelyn listed among traveling healers who served several mountain communities approximately 41 years ago. Elena leaned forward. A healer? Yes. The scholar pointed toward the faded entry. But what makes this unusual is what comes next. He turned another page. A second entry appeared less than a year later. Same name, different notation, missing. The room fell silent. Sebastian studied the page carefully. Missing, no explanation was ever recorded. Elena felt a strange chill despite the sunlight filling the room. Missing, not deceased, not relocated, simply missing. The mystery seemed to deepen every time they uncovered a new clue. Hours passed. More documents arrived. More dead ends appeared. Then, shortly before sunset, one of the physicians rushed into the archives carrying a sealed envelope discovered inside an old desk hidden behind a false panel. The wax seal had partially crumbled with age. The physician carefully opened the letter and unfolded the single sheet inside. Most of the ink had faded, but one sentence remained perfectly legible. The room became silent as he read it aloud. If the child survives, she must never be brought to the castle until the prince begins to wake. Elena froze. Every sound around her seemed to disappear. The scholars stopped moving. The physicians exchanged stunned looks. Even Sebastian remained motionless. The sentence hung in the air like a key turning inside a lock. If the child survives, Elena's fingers slowly closed around the silver pendant beneath her sweater. She had worn it every day since childhood. She had never questioned where it came from, never questioned why her grandmother always insisted she keep it safe. Unfortunately for Elena, somewhere deep inside the castle, another forgotten document had already revealed something even more alarming. And hidden at the bottom of that document was a family name that would change everything. The castle felt quieter that night, but it was the kind of quiet that came before answers, not after them. Elena stood alone beside a tall window overlooking the valley. Below, scattered town lights shimmered like distant stars. She should have been thinking about the bakery, about unpaid bills, about the life she had left behind only a few days earlier. Instead, her thoughts kept returning to a single sentence. If the child survives. The words echoed in her mind with unsettling persistence. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Before she could answer, the door opened and Sebastian stepped inside. He carried a weathered leather folder beneath one arm. The king looked more tired than she had ever seen him. Not physically, something deeper. The exhaustion of a man who had spent 40 years searching for a door that finally appeared to be opening. "I thought you should see this," he said. Elena motioned toward the small table near the fireplace. Sebastian placed the folder down carefully. Inside were several photographs, handwritten records, and a single folded document protected beneath clear archival paper. Elena immediately recognized the family name printed near. The heart skipped. For a moment she simply stared. "That cannot be possible." Sebastian remained silent. Elena picked up the document. The paper looked decades old. Most of the text had faded, but several sections remained legible. One line listed the transfer of guardianship for an unnamed infant. Another referenced a woman who had relocated to a neighboring county shortly after a medical emergency involving a traveling healer named Evelyn. Elena lowered the paper slowly. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died," she said quietly. "She never talked about her past." "Did she ever mention Evelyn?" Sebastian asked. Elena shook her head. "Never." The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, wind brushed against the castle walls. The atmosphere felt strangely different tonight, less like an investigation, more like two people standing at the edge of a truth neither fully understood. Sebastian carefully opened another document. "There is something else." Elena looked down. It was a letter. Unlike the others, this one remained remarkably well preserved. The handwriting was elegant and precise. Only part of the text survived, but enough remained to paint a picture. "The child must be protected from the burden of knowledge. If the prince remains asleep, her life must remain her own." Elena swallowed. "But if he begins to wake, she deserves the truth." The room fell silent. The truth. The phrase felt heavier than everything else they had uncovered. "Do you think Evelyn wrote this?" Elena asked. "I do." "Then she knew something nobody else knew." Sebastian nodded slowly. "Which means she may have understood the curse better than anyone." Elena looked toward the fire. For the first time since arriving at the castle, fear began mixing with curiosity. Not fear of the king, not fear of the castle. Fear of discovering that her entire life had been built around a secret she never knew existed. At that exact moment, less than 100 feet away, another change occurred inside Lucien's chamber. A physician performing routine observations suddenly froze. The prince's hand had moved again. Not a twitch this time, not a reflex. His fingers slowly closed around the edge of the blanket. Within minutes, the news spread through the castle. By the time a servant arrived breathless at Elena's door, the physicians had already confirmed it. Lucien's condition was improving faster than ever before. Elena and Sebastian hurried through the corridors together. The halls buzzed with cautious excitement. Hope was no longer a distant possibility. It was becoming measurable, real. When they entered the chamber, the physician stepped aside. Lucien remained asleep, but the glowing symbol now stretched nearly the length of his forearm. Golden lines pulsed softly beneath his skin like living light. Elena moved closer. Then she noticed something new. Tiny markings had begun appearing within the pattern. Letters, ancient letters, symbols forming words. The oldest physician adjusted his glasses and stared in disbelief. "We translated the first section." Sebastian looked at him immediately. "What does it say?" The physician hesitated. His expression shifted from confusion to astonishment. Then he read the words aloud. "Waiting for Evelyn." The room went completely silent, because for 40 years everyone had assumed the prince was trapped by a curse. But those 3 words suggested something far more mysterious. Perhaps the prince had not been waiting for a cure at all. Perhaps he had been waiting for someone. The words changed everything. Waiting for Evelyn. The translation spread through the chamber like a shockwave, yet nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the steady rhythm of Lucien's strengthening heartbeat. Elena stared at the glowing symbols on his arm, waiting for Evelyn. Not fighting a curse, not resisting healers, waiting. The realization felt impossible. For 40 years, physicians, scholars, and specialists had assumed the prince was trapped in an endless sleep, but now a different possibility stood before them. What if Lucien had never been unreachable at all? What if he had simply been waiting for someone specific? The oldest physician carefully copied the symbols into a notebook. "There are more markings appearing every hour," he said. "We may be looking at a message rather than a medical condition." Sebastian stood beside the bed without taking his eyes off his son. "Then translate all of it." The command was calm, but Elena heard the urgency beneath it. For the first time in decades, answers were finally within reach. The following morning, the castle's memorial chamber was opened. Few people entered the room anymore. It sat beneath the oldest tower, protected by heavy stone walls, stained glass windows that spaced with soft blue light. Elena followed Sebastian through rows of marble statues and carved memorial plaques. The atmosphere felt reverent, quiet, almost sacred. At the center of the chamber stood a glass display case. Inside rested several personal belongings preserved from the year Lucien fell asleep: a journal, a silver pocket watch, a folded letter, and a framed sketch of a young woman. Elena stopped walking. The woman in the drawing was unmistakably the same person from the missing portrait. "Evelyn," Sebastian said quietly. It was the first time Elena had ever heard him speak the name aloud. She stepped closer. The sketch showed a woman with kind eyes and simple clothing. Nothing about her suggested royalty or wealth, yet someone had preserved her memory for 40 years. "Who was she?" Elena asked. Sebastian remained silent for a moment, then he answered, "The last healer my son ever trusted." Elena looked at him. "Trusted?" Before the sleep began, Lucien rejected every physician brought to the castle. He cooperated with none of them. Then Evelyn arrived. Sunlight shifted through the stained glass. Colored reflections moved across the floor. "What happened?" Elena asked. Sebastian's gaze settled on the sketch. For the first time, he allowed someone to help him. The answer surprised her, not because of what he said, because of how he said it. There was grief in his voice, respect, regret. "Did she fail?" Elena asked quietly. "No." Sebastian's silver eyes lifted toward hers. "I think she succeeded." The words lingered in the chamber. At that exact moment, several floors above them, a translator working on the glowing symbols made another discovery. Less than 10 minutes later, a servant arrived breathless at the memorial chamber. "Your Majesty." He struggled to catch his breath. "The next section has been translated." Sebastian and Elena returned immediately. The physicians gathered around a table covered with notes and sketches. The translator pointed toward a newly decoded passage. His hands trembled slightly. "We are certain of this translation." Sebastian read the line first. Then Elena read it. Her heart skipped. "The promise remains. Blood remembers what memory forgets." Silence followed. Every person in the room understood the implication. Blood, the symbol, the pendant, Evelyn. None of the clues pointed toward coincidence anymore. They pointed toward inheritance, toward family, toward a connection that had survived 4 decades. Elena instinctively touched the pendant beneath her sweater. This time Sebastian noticed. His eyes followed the movement. Neither spoke, neither needed to, because for the first time since arriving at the castle, both of them were beginning to suspect the same impossible truth. And hidden within a locked drawer that had not been opened in 40 years lay one final document capable of proving it. The locked drawer was hidden inside a cabinet no one had opened in decades. By the time the key was finally found, evening had settled across the castle. Golden light faded beyond the windows, while lamps flickered to life throughout the archive wing. Elena stood beside Sebastian as the ancient lock turned with a soft click. Dust drifted into the air. Inside rested a single leather journal wrapped in faded cloth, nothing more. The simplicity somehow made it feel even more important. The oldest archivist carefully carried it to a reading table. Everyone gathered around. The cover showed signs of aid intact. On the first page, written in elegant handwriting, was a name, Evelyn Hart. The room fell silent. For the first time, Evelyn was no longer a rumor or a missing file. She was real. Elena watched as the archivist slowly turned the pages. Most entries described travel between small mountain towns, notes about patience, weather, long roads, ordinary details from an ordinary life. Yet every few pages another name appeared, Lucien, the prince. The entries gradually changed in tone. The writer spoke about a condition nobody understood, not cursed, not sick, waiting. Elena felt her pulse quicken. One passage in particular captured everyone's attention. The archivist read it aloud. "He does not reject help, he rejects fear. Every healer sees a problem to solve. He only responds when he feels safe." No one spoke. The words reframed 40 years of assumptions. Another entry followed several pages later. "The bond is incomplete. Blood must return to where the promise began. Sebastian lowered his eyes. The translator immediately copied the sentence beside the symbols taken from Lucien's arm. The phrasing matched, the language matched. The clues were beginning to align. Hours passed as they continued reading. Outside, darkness settled over the valley. Inside, the castle remained awake. Then Elena noticed something tucked between 2 pages near the end of the journal, a folded document, smaller than a letter. The paper looked fragile enough to crumble. A sketch appeared, not of a castle, not of a patient, a pendant. The same pendant Elena carried every day. The room seemed to stop breathing. The drawing matched perfectly, the circular frame. The tiny star hidden at the center. Elena slowly removed the pendant from beneath her sweater and placed it beside the sketch. No difference existed between them, none. Sebastian stared at both objects for a long moment. "Your grandmother gave that to you?" Elena nodded. The archivist turned the paper over. More writing appeared on the reverse side, faded but legible. The translator leaned closer. His eyes widened. "There is a name here." Elena felt her stomach tighten. The translator swallowed before reading it aloud. "For my granddaughter." No one moved, no one spoke. Granddaughter. The word landed with undeniable weight. Elena stared at the page. She could hear the crackling fireplace, the rustle of turning paper. Her own heartbeat, everything else disappeared. Evelyn was not merely connected to her, Evelyn was family. The realization settled slowly. Then another thought followed. If Evelyn had been waiting for a granddaughter to inherit the pendant, then none of this had happened by accident. Not the castle, not the symbol, not Lucien's response, not her arrival. At that exact moment, several floors above them, another change occurred inside the prince's chamber. The glowing markings covering his arm brightened dramatically. Physicians rushed toward the bed, instruments rattled. Notes scattered across desks, and for the first time in 40 years, Lucien Romano slowly opened his eyes halfway before closing them again. Just long enough to reveal that awakening was no longer a distant possibility. It had already begun. The castle did not sleep that night. News of Lucien's brief awakening spread quietly through the halls, carried in whispers rather than celebrations. No one wanted to risk disappointment. Elena stood outside the prince's chamber as dawn painted the eastern sky in pale shades of gold and blue. The pendant rested in her palm. For most of her life it had been nothing more than a family keepsake. A piece of a story that had started long before she was born. The chamber doors opened and one of the physicians stepped out. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. "His condition remains stable," he said. "The markings continue to evolve." Morning light spilled across the room. Lucien lay motionless beneath the blankets, but the atmosphere had changed. The stillness no longer felt lifeless. It felt temporary, like winter preparing to surrender to spring. The golden symbols along his arm now extended across his shoulder. New words had appeared during the night. Translators worked from nearby desks covered with notes and reference books. One of them carefully approached Sebastian. "We completed another section." The king immediately crossed the room. Elena followed. The translator pointed toward a page filled with copied symbols. The messages becoming clearer. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. "The promise survives through blood. The path returns through choice. Only the willing may open the final door." Silence followed. Elena looked toward Sebastian. "What does that mean?" The king remained thoughtful. "It means this was never a cure." The translator nodded. "We believe the prince entered this state voluntarily." Several physicians exchanged confused looks. "Voluntarily?" one repeated. "Why would anyone choose 40 years of sleep?" The answer arrived sooner than expected. Later that afternoon, another section of Evelyn's journal revealed the truth. Elena sat beside Sebastian in the library as the archivist carefully read the newly restored entry aloud. "Lucien understands the danger better than anyone. The curse cannot be defeated by force. If completed incorrectly, it will consume every memory tied to the promise. He has chosen to wait rather than risk destroying what remains." Elena stared at the page. "He chose this. To protect something," Sebastian said quietly. The realization settled heavily between them. For 40 years, everyone had believed Lucien was a victim. In reality, he had made a sacrifice, one nobody fully understood. The sun drifted lower outside. Hours passed, more fragments emerged from the journal. Each one pointed toward the same conclusion. Evelyn had discovered a solution before she disappeared. She had entrusted that solution to the future, to her family, to someone who would come after her, to Elena. As evening approached, Sebastian handed her a final page recovered from the journal's hidden compartment. The paper was addressed to no one, yet Elena somehow knew it was meant for her. The handwriting was unmistakably Evelyn's. "If you are reading this, then the waiting is almost over." Do not be afraid of what you discover. You were never chosen by destiny. That is different. That is stronger. Elena felt her throat tighten. She read the words twice, then a third time. Loved into this story. Not chosen, not destined. Simply connected by family, memory, and a promise that refused to disappear. At that exact moment, a sudden commotion erupted from the prince's chamber. Footsteps echoed through the corridor. Physicians hurried past the library doors. Sebastian and Elena exchanged a glance before running after them. When they entered the room, every person stood frozen beside the bed. Lucien's eyes were open, not halfway, not briefly, fully open. Clear silver eyes stared toward the ceiling, awake. A murmur swept through the chamber. 40 Lucien slowly turned his head. His gaze moved across the room until it settled directly on Elena, and the first words he spoke were not a question. They were a name, Evelyn. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Lucien's silver eyes remained fixed on Elena, as though 40 years had vanished in an instant. The room stood frozen around them. Physicians clutched notebooks. Servants stared openly. Even Sebastian Romano looked stunned. The prince had spoken only one word, yet that single name carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Evelyn, Lucien repeated softly. His voice sounded rough from disuse, but there was no confusion in it. She stepped closer to the bed. "I am not Evelyn," she said gently. Lucien studied her face. For a moment, disappointment flickered across his expression, then something else appeared. Recognition. Not of who she was, but of what she represented. His gaze lowered toward the pendant resting against her sweater. The golden markings along his arm pulsed once. Warm light rippled beneath his skin before slowly fading. "The pendant," Lucien whispered. She kept her promise. Silence filled the room again. Sebastian moved closer, loose father. Emotion crossed the king's face so quickly that Elena almost missed it. 40 years of waiting, 40 years of uncertainty, and now his son was looking back at him. "Welcome home," Sebastian said quietly. Lucien stared at him for several long seconds before offering the faintest smile. It was small, tired, real. The kind of smile that belonged to someone returning from a very long journey. Later that evening, after the physicians completed their examinations, only a handful of people remained inside the chamber. The atmosphere had changed completely. Candles burned softly against the walls. Rain no longer struck the windows. For the first time since Elena arrived at the castle, peace seemed possible. Lucien sat upright against several pillows while Sebastian reviewed pages from Evelyn's journal. Elena remained near the fireplace, listening. "You remember her?" Sebastian asked. Lucien nodded, more clearly than I remember anything else. His voice had grown steadier with each passing hour. Everyone thought she failed. Sebastian lowered the journal. "Did she?" Lucien shook his head. "No," the answer came without hesitation. She was the only person who understood. Elena leaned forward slightly. Lucien looked toward her. The firelight reflected in his silver eyes. The promise. He glanced at the pendant again. A long time ago, an ancient bond was created between our family and hers. Not a curse, not a prophecy, a promise. The room remained silent as he continued. When the bond began to break, everyone searched for ways to force it back together. Evelyn knew that would destroy it completely. Sebastian listened carefully. Lucien nodded. We both did. The realization settled over the room. 40 years had not been an accident. They had been a sacrifice. A choice made to preserve something fragile enough to survive only through patience and trust. Elena looked down at the pendant resting in her hands. Suddenly her grandmother's warnings made sense. Protect it, keep it close. One day you will understand. She finally did. At that exact moment, Lucien reached into the pocket of the blanket draped beside him. The movement surprised everyone. Slowly he withdrew a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, carefully preserved. "Evelyn gave me this before I went to sleep," he said. His gaze settled on Elena. "She said I would know when to deliver it." The room became completely silent. Elena accepted the letter with trembling fingers. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting faded by time, were only 3 words. For my granddaughter. The letter remained unopened for several seconds. Elena could feel every eye in the room resting on the faded paper in her hands. The fire crackled softly inside the chamber. Beyond the tall windows, night stretched across the mountains, calm and silent after days of uncertainty. Carefully she unfolded the letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. She immediately recognized it from Evelyn's journal. The room seemed to fade away as she began reading. "If this letter has reached you, then Lucien is awake, and the waiting is over. First know this. You were never born to carry a burden. You were never meant to sacrifice your future for the past. Everything I did was so that you could live freely. If you are here now, it means you chose kindness when no one asked you to. That choice matters more than blood." Elena paused. Emotion tightened her throat. She continued reading. "Many people will tell stories about destiny. Do not believe them. The promise survived because ordinary people protected it. A father who refused to give up on his son. A grandmother who protected a child. A young prince willing to wait. Love kept this promise alive, not magic." Silence filled the chamber. Even the physician standing near the door seemed moved by the words. Elena reached the final section. The bond was never a curse. It was a promise of trust between two families. Long ago, that trust was broken by fear. Lucien chose sleep because forcing the bond would destroy it forever. The only way forward was patience. One day, someone from my family would return freely, not because they were commanded to, but because they chose to help. If you are reading this, then that person is you. For the first time since arriving at the castle, every piece of the mystery fit together. The pendant, the symbols, Evelyn, Lucien's long sleep. None of it had been about power or prophecy. It had been about preserving trust until the right person arrived. Across the room, Lucienne smiled faintly. She always believed people would do the right thing eventually. Sebastian looked toward his son. The tension he had carried for decades seemed lighter now. Not gone entirely, but lighter. "And she was right," he said quietly. The physicians spent the next several hours completing their final examinations. The results astonished everyone. Lucien's condition had stabilized completely. The golden markings that once covered his arm began fading one by one. Their purpose had been fulfilled. The message had been delivered. The promise had been completed. Near midnight, most of the castle finally settled into peaceful silence. Elena stepped onto a balcony overlooking the valley. Cool air drifted across the stone railing below. Countless lights shimmered from towns scattered throughout the mountains. Footsteps approached behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. Sebastian stopped beside her. For a while neither spoke. They simply watched the distant horizon. "You could leave tomorrow," Sebastian finally said. Elena smiled softly. "That sounds suspiciously like permission." A faint laugh escaped him. The sound surprised both of them. "After everything that happened, I thought you might be eager to return home." Elena looked toward the sleeping towns below. Then she looked back at the castle behind them. It no longer felt cold. It no longer felt like a place filled with unanswered questions. "I think I need to decide what home means now," she admitted. Sebastian nodded. He understood more than she realized. Above them, clouds drifted apart, revealing a sky full of stars. The waiting was over. The mystery was solved. And for the first time in 40 years, the future belonged entirely to the living. The first sunrise after Lucien's awakening felt different from every morning that had come before it. Golden light spilled across the castle towers and rolled gently over the mountains beyond, touching stone walls that had spent 4 decades carrying the weight of uncertainty. Elena stood on the eastern balcony with a warm cup of coffee in her hands. Below, the courtyard had already come alive. Servants moved through open gates. Gardeners trimmed hedges. Laughter drifted upward from somewhere near the kitchens. It was not a dramatic change. It was something quieter. Life returning to places that had forgotten how to expect good news. Behind her, footsteps approached. Lucienne stepped onto the balcony, moving slowly but steadily. The physician still insisted he avoid overexertion, though each hour seemed to restore more strength. He paused beside the railing and looked toward the horizon. "I forgot how bright mornings are," he said. Elena smiled. "Most people only miss them for a few extra hours of sleep." A soft laugh escaped him. It still seemed remarkable hearing laughter from someone who had spent 40 years asleep. They stood together in comfortable silence. The air smelled of pine trees and fresh bread rising from the castle kitchens. Eventually Lucien spoke again. "Evelyn would have liked you." Elena looked down at the pendant resting against her sweater. "I wish I could have met her." "You did." She glanced toward him. Lucien's silver eyes reflected the morning light. Not directly, but every choice she made led here. Elena thought about the journal, the letters, her grandmother, the years of protection she never understood. For most of her life she had believed she came from nothing extraordinary. Now she understood that ordinary lives could still carry extraordinary kindness. Later that afternoon, the castle hosted a gathering unlike any it had seen in decades. Physicians, scholars, servants and townspeople filled the grand hall, not for a ceremony, not for a royal announcement, simply to celebrate. Long tables overflowed with food. Music echoed beneath vaulted ceilings. The atmosphere felt warm and human in a way Elena had never expected from a place she once considered intimidating. Throughout the celebration, Sebastian remained surprisingly approachable. The distant king she met during the storm seemed increasingly replaced by a man relieved to have his family back. At one point, he found Elena standing near a window overlooking the gardens. "There is something I have been meaning to ask." She raised an eyebrow. A faint smile appeared. "Perhaps." He handed her a folded document. Elena opened it carefully. The paper contained ownership records for the small bakery where she worked. Her eyes widened. "What is this?" The building was scheduled for demolition next year. Elena looked up sharply. Sebastian nodded. "Not anymore." She stared at the document, speechless. "You bought it? Technically." "Technically?" "The castle invested in it." The explanations sounded suspiciously rehearsed. Elena laughed despite herself. For the first time in years, the future felt open rather than uncertain. As evening approached, guests slowly departed and lanterns illuminated the gardens. Lucien spent hours speaking with people who had never expected to meet him. Sebastian watched with quiet pride. Elena watched too. The weight hanging over the castle was finally gone. The mystery had ended. The waiting had ended. And standing beneath the glow of hundreds of lanterns, she realized something important. She no longer felt like a visitor. She felt like someone who belonged. 3 weeks later, the castle courtyard looked nothing like the place Elena first entered during the storm. Back then, rain had turned the stone pathways dark and empty. The air had felt cold, silent, heavy with unanswered questions. Now sunlight filled every corner. Flower beds bloomed along the walkways. Children laughed near the fountain. Open market stalls lined the courtyard for the annual community festival that had been cancelled year after year during Lucien's long absence. Today, for the first time in 4 decades, the celebration finally returned. Elena stood behind a wooden table covered with fresh bread. The scent of cinnamon, honey, and warm dough drifted through the afternoon air. Several villagers gathered nearby, happily arguing over which pastries they wanted to buy first. The small bakery she once feared losing had become busier than ever, not because of royal attention, because people genuinely loved what she created. That mattered more. Across the courtyard, Lucien sat beneath a shade tree surrounded by children from nearby towns. He was telling stories, not royal stories, not stories about castles or ancient promises, stories about ordinary moments he remembered before his long sleep. The children listened with complete fascination. Every so often, one of them would reach for a roll from the basket beside him. Lucien always pretended not to notice. Sebastian watched the scene from a distance. The king no longer looked like a man carrying 40 years of grief. The sharp edges of sorrow had softened. Hope had finally replaced waiting. Elena noticed him approaching and handed him a small loaf fresh from the oven. "Careful," she said. "That one is still hot." Sebastian accepted it with a smile. "You say that every time, and you ignore me every time." "That is because I am the king." Elena laughed. "That is a terrible excuse." The easy conversation felt natural now, comfortable, the kind that only develops after people survive something important together. They walked slowly through the festival while musicians played near the fountain. Villagers greeted them warmly. Nobody spoke about curses anymore. Nobody whispered about mysteries. The story had become something simpler. A family reunited, a promise fulfilled, a future reclaimed. As the afternoon faded toward evening, the castle bells rang softly across the valley. Guests gathered near the courtyard fountain for a final toast. Lucien stood beside his father. Elena stood beside them. The golden light of sunset painted the stone walls in warm shades of amber. For a moment, everyone simply appreciated being together. No speeches were necessary, no grand announcements. The answers people spent 40 years searching for had already arrived. Later, after the festival ended and the last visitors returned home, Elena found herself standing alone near the courtyard entrance, the same entrance where she had arrived carrying bread through a storm. The memory felt distant now. She could almost see that younger version of herself climbing the mountain road without any idea that her life was about to change. Footsteps approached behind her. Sebastian stopped beside her and followed her gaze toward the gate. "Thinking about leaving?" he asked. Elena smiled softly. "Actually, I was thinking about arriving." The king looked toward the courtyard filled with lantern light, toward Lucien laughing with friends near the fountain, toward the bakery tables still covered with fresh bread, toward the life they had all built together. Then he nodded, because he understood exactly what she meant. Above them, stars slowly appeared across the evening sky. The storm was gone, the waiting was over, the promise had been kept. And in the courtyard where silence once ruled, a prince shared bread with children, while the people he loved stood nearby beneath the last light of day.